afternoon and welcome. Today is the final webinar in our Business Not As Usual series for 2020. We will certainly be doing more next year. It's been a huge success. We've had over 5,000 registrations for the series, and it really has been a delight to explore all those different areas with some of our industry partners and our alumni. And so we're very grateful to everyone that's taken part, that's attended, and that's also been donating their time as a panelist. I'm Fiona O'Sullivan, Director, External Engagement and International for the Business School. Today, our audience includes our alumni, industry partners, academic staff, and students. From a geographic perspective, we've actually got over 25 countries that people are registering from, which is great. Now, common protocol in a webinar, you're all muted. So what we'd love is for you to put your questions into the Slido platform. That's www.slido.com using the event code BNAUW9. We're going to try and get to all the most pressing questions. Naturally, sometimes we can't get to them all, and we hope you'll bear with us for that. But please feel free also to upvote the questions that you think are most pressing for you. Now, the University of Sydney Business School is located on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And here they've been sharing knowledge, teaching and learning for thousands of years. And as we continue these practices within the business school, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal custodianship of country and pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the lands we meet on today, because we are a very geographically dispersed audience. So, our speakers today are Nicole Scoble-Williams, who's partner at Deloitte, activating the Future of Work movement, and Nicole is based in Japan. She's a passionate pioneer activating future readiness through harnessing the collective intelligence of humans and machines. Joining her is John Williams, partner and co-founder at Fifth Frame. And he's spent the last few years really focusing on leadership and culture and the importance of those two connected concepts for organizational survival as the world of work is significantly being disrupted by technology, and certainly has in the last 6 months since we previously met him. We also have Professor Kairemer. Now, Kai is a professor of information technology and organization, and is also the head of discipline for business information systems at the business school. He is also the co-leader of the Digital Disruption Research Group and co-host of Australia's leading technology in business podcast, The Future This Week, on Sydney Business Insights. So I'm going to hand over to Kai, who's going to have a really interactive discussion today, and they're going to be exploring how COVID-19 has changed the way we work. Now, back in May, the three of them came together to look at the changing face of the workforce. So what we thought then and what those changes that we were anticipating were then, are they the ones that have happened? As we're starting to see COVID work restrictions end, what's been the impact? Is it what we've imagined? And actually, more importantly, over to Kai and John and Nicole, what do you believe are going to be the lasting changes for the world of work and the future of work?
Thank you, Fiona. Thanks, Fiona, and welcome to everyone who's joined this webinar today. Don't you worry, the US election will go on for quite a while, so you're not missing too much. And I have turned off my stat screen not to distract myself. So we live in interesting times. There's a lot going on. And COVID has been going on for quite a while. Now, we're going to have an interesting discussion because we in Australia are in a not necessarily unique, but in a pretty special position if we look around the world, where countries are grappling with a second or even a third wave, or haven't really gotten a handle on the pandemic at all. Whereas in Australia and New Zealand, we're doing incredibly well, one must say. So we're living in two different worlds globally. So this is going to be an interesting discussion because the experience in Australia is slightly different to that in other countries. And when we met in May, we were just at the height of lockdowns, and we were all working from home. And as you can see in my background, I'm still working from home. And so the interesting effect now is that things are slowly opening up. The cities are coming back to life. It was Melbourne Cup Day yesterday. People were out and about, which is good to see. But as much as restaurants are filling up, offices in my own observation are not, because I was in the office yesterday and I was cheerfully bumping into 2 of my colleagues when there's normally more than 20 or 25. So a lot of workplaces are still working from home. And there's all kinds of different implications with that for the world of work. It's implications for employment, the way we work, the way we manage people, we motivate each other. And so I'm really pleased to be joined again by Nicole and John, and we had such great discussions. And I want us to start off with the obvious question as to Nicole and John, and I'm starting with Nicole. What of what happened in the last 6 months, almost 6 months, went the way you thought it would, and what surprised you now that we're half a year later?
Yeah, an amazing question. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here again. It's, you know, back with good friends, I feel. We had such a great discussion, and I think we all know where we're going to land with this conversation is yet to be seen, but I'm sure it's going to be amazing. I think that early on, we already saw quite quickly the impact of technology and what was actually possible in terms of usage and adoption. And even though that surprised us, you know, I think in the beginning, I don't think it surprised us to see the way that that's continued to feature, and that as we've progressed, technology is now just, you know, it's assumed, it's a hygiene factor. And it's what I would call a part of the hard wiring. But I think what surprised me more than anything is the extreme challenge it has been to also turn our minds to the soft wiring. So for example, there are so many organizations that say to me, we've done quite well. We'd already been working virtually in some kind of way, even before COVID. So we've done pretty well. And I then say, oh, great. So tell me, how did you adapt your performance management framework? How did you adapt your rewards and recognition? What did you do with your leadership development framework for developing inclusive leadership and all of those things? And all of a sudden, I kind of get very blank looks. And so that is something that has surprised me. Despite the way that we've continued to really harness the amazing things that we've been able to achieve with technology, I think I've been a little surprised and disappointed, to be honest, that we haven't seen yet the same progress that I think we are capable of on that soft wiring. And so for me, I think it's about how do you think about this acceleration of change through the lens of the human dimension of work? So rather than saying, what's the technology we need? Where can we use technology? Actually stepping back and saying, what are the amazing human capabilities here that we need to access, curate, you know, really develop, and then using the technology to enable and elevate those. So I've been a bit surprised that, you know, we haven't quite turned our mind to that human dimension yet.
John, what are your observations? What surprised you? What went as expected?
Well, I hate it when I have to agree with Nicole, but I'm going to have to agree with Nicole. So I think, you know, and when we last spoke was early in this thing. The first 3 months looked at objectively were amazing. People, you know, managed to do things that they couldn't possibly imagine that they'd be able to do. They moved entire workforces home. They switched people to using their laptops. To everyone, no one knew about Zoom in April. And by May, everyone was a bloody expert, right? So there's this amazing shift that happened in a very short period of time. Kai, you used a phrase, you were talking about the current environment, and you said, cities are, and I thought you were going to say, getting back to normal. And you actually said, opening up. But I think there's a strong sense in people's mind that we've done that thing. The next 6 months has been, to me, a bit underwhelming. We've actually carried on doing the same jobs in the same structure with, as Nicole says, the same, you know, measurement systems and reward systems. We've just done them from home instead of from offices. We really haven't taken the next step to reinvent jobs, to reinvent measurement systems, to reinvent the way people interact. And we've kind of had this sort of, and we're lucky in a way in Australia, we're able to have a status quo. We've had a status quo for 6 months. And now I think lots of people are looking to sort of get back to normal when they can. And if we don't do something now, that's what's going to happen. If we don't put in place.
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're going back to a functioning normal, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing to go back to a normal if the normal that we had pre-COVID was actually working well, right? But my observation would be that because of the way in which remote working has now been legitimized and actually works for many people and has become part of what we do, I'd like to stay with the assumption that a good part of that will stay, much more so than we used to, right, across the board. And look at the challenges that poses. And you might challenge me on that, John, and say, look, we're going all back to the office, and this whole remote thing is not going to happen. But we do see in a lot of office type jobs, and certainly across the university right now, there's a lot of remote working still. We will end up with what we might call blended or hybrid workforces or work environments, right? And there's a real danger that as many people flock back to the office and we don't change the culture, we don't change the way we do things, we end up with a two-speed workforce or a two-class work society, so to speak, where the center of gravity is still in the office, because this is still where the decisions are being made. This is still where you're most visible. And so my worry is that people who work remotely at some point will find themselves behind the 8 ball, and there will be a pull back to the office. How do you build, is my question, and I might stick with you, John, and then I'll bring you back in, Nicole. How do you create the kind of managerial systems or the management practices that puts remote and office work onto the same footing? I think that's a real challenge.
Yeah, so I think you need to acknowledge that that's the case, which most people haven't yet done. They're still people just doing the jobs they were always doing on the same career paths they were always on. So acknowledging that that's the case is the first step, and then actually architecting what does that look like. These are the jobs that can be done in this way. So at the moment we're pretending that all jobs are equal, and all jobs, office jobs, can be equally done from home or in the workplace. That's just patently not true. And it only works when everyone is forced to work in one mode. So when everyone's, or the vast majority, are forced to work from home, happy days, it's fine, everyone can do it, and everyone kind of loves it. But, work isn't, unfortunately, all about collaboration between co-workers for a greater good. Work is very often competitive within organizations. And whenever there's a competitive situation within an organization or even between organizations, people will make the unpleasant choice not to drop their kids at school, not to miss the commute. They'll make the unpleasant choice to go into work because they think it gives them some advantage. Because that's kind of human drive and human history and human behavior, right? So we need to recognize that that is the case. Now, there are other jobs and other people in other stages of life that are more task-focused, single contributor output focused, where it is okay for that job to be done and measured as a single contributor from a remote location. And we should acknowledge that and then construct those jobs to do that. But at the moment, we're pretending we were in the old world. That kind of half works in the new world where everyone's at home, but it really starts to fall about when you get the blended scenario, because the human drives, right? So if we don't if we don't do that work now, put in place those structures, put in place those jobs, there will be a drift back. Once there's a cure or a vaccine, there will be a drift back. There's some folk who think we're all going to work from home forever. There's some folk who think we'll be back in the office. That the answer is clearly somewhere in between. The less we do now, the more it's going to revert to everyone back in the office, because that's just the safe default position.
And as you say, that's the real challenge, right? How do I find the right balance that disadvantages no one? And Nicole, you mentioned earlier, you go to your clients and you ask around, what have you done with your performance frameworks, with your career progression, with your mentoring, with all those kind of things. What do you think, like specifically, what are the most important things, and how can you help? What's your advice, where to start, how to actually build the kind of practices that do not disadvantage those that work remotely?
Yeah, and adding on what John said there, I've been fascinated. For me, I feel this all anchors on inclusive leadership. And I have been flabbergasted with how few clients have an answer for me when I ask them, help me understand what you're doing right now around your inclusive leadership strategy. And they look at me and they say, right now is not the time for us to worry about women representation and all of this. And I take a breath and then I say, well, let's think about flexible working, hybrid working, giving us the ability to connect the right work to the right worker at the right time, really enabling us to increase productivity, generate greater value, elevate the experience for our workforce and our customers. How are we going to be able to connect the right work to the right worker and all of that if we don't have leaders that are leading the charge and actually orchestrating the way that that team works and creating that culture of trust and confidence where this is just the way we work. It's designed into our daily flow of work. So for me, one of the most important moments to start with is team formation at the working team level. The most important moment, we're about to start a new team. Okay, team, let's first of all create our hybrid working charter. What are our work style preferences? How are we going to manage work in the flow of life? And for me, if you don't have inclusive leadership and you can't foster that culture of trust and confidence, then we can't even start to think about creating all those other frameworks and all of those things. So I've had a lot of clients kind of say to me, wow, aha moment, hadn't even had inclusive leadership on my priorities. And very quickly, okay, I get it. If I want to take this moment and really use hybrid working to drive competitive advantage, then I need to be thinking about that.
Then let me ask you, just John, just on this, pragmatically, right? Inclusive or equitable in a team. Let's take a meeting situation, right? The problem though is that the people who are in the office, they might go to a meeting room and then everyone else gets zoomed into the meeting room. But then you have a number of people in the room who can chat and who can have coffee, and then some people on screens, right? The right thing to do would be we stay all in front of our screens, right? We do not go into the meeting room. What's your advice around that? Is that what you would do? Because the meeting room is there, it's not utilized, is where we normally go. The pull of the meeting room to have the meeting there is very strong, isn't it?
It is, but the folk that have done this for a long time would absolutely say, even if 8 of the 10 are in the office and 2 are zooming in, the 8 should go back to their desk, put their headphones on and zoom in as well, and the meeting will work. Now, you'll still get the benefit of sitting next to the person who's also zooming in and the sideways glance or the shared coffee, or, so you're never going to equalize the playing field completely, but that meeting will be more effective if everyone's operating in the same mode. I mean, our experience is you can have 2 groups of kind of 4 together, both zooming in, that kind of works. But as soon as one person's on Zoom or one person's on this kind of interaction, everyone should be. The thing I'd say that underpins what Nicole was saying is we operate with this illusion that we understand how our own organization works. And actually, I don't think we do understand how our own organizations work in many instances. And I mean, Nicole's in Japan. Japanese organizations are famously complex in terms of trying to work out what their decision-making process is. A request for decisions kind of goes into a vacuum and bounces around lots of status-laden relationships and meetings, and eventually an answer pops out somewhere else. Australia's not that different, right? So we think we know, because we've got an organization chart with boxes and lines and reporting lines and accountabilities and KPIs, how the organization works, and actually we don't, because it's way more subtle than that. So then trying to pretend that we can then move everyone remotely and just operate the same way because the boxes and the lines are still the same, actually doesn't work, because we don't know how decisions were made, who influenced who, how they did it, who shared information in what way. We don't have a really good map of that at an organizational level. So then it does, as Nicole says, it then comes all back to leadership. It comes all back to the local leaders. Local leaders become actually much more important in that context because they can pick up all of those subtleties, those decision-making, those key players, those influencers, those bits of information that get shared in a meeting that no longer exists, all of those things. That's the role of the local manager, who needs to actually be able to galvanize their team and make sure everyone feels included in that conversation.
That's a really important point, John, and I want to tie in with that. I mean, I've been with my organization 11 years, and I'm surprised on a weekly basis about, you know, the things that can happen. Now imagine someone starting a job, right? A lot of our graduates have to start their job under the current conditions, and it's a little bit better now than it was a few months ago. But let's say someone starts a job in a hybrid environment. What is your advice, or what do you see organizations can do when it comes to onboarding, to actually the induction, for people to actually learn at least the basics of how the organization works, when the organization has now disappeared into, you know, hybrid virtual relationships that happens through screens? Nicole.
Yeah, I think the onboarding moment, if you like, has been one that is front of mind for every organisation that I've spoken to. One of the things that's become really clear over the last 6 months are there are some moments that we know we really need to double down on and focus with a sense of urgency. And onboarding is really emerging as one of those. One of the things that I think is really important is to acknowledge what are those moments within onboarding that are really important, where we really do need to think about how are we going to create that connection, that knowledge transfer in new and different ways. So for example, if the onboarding process normally meant that you would do a meet and greet with this person, you know, in this area of this function, or this customer, or this client, or you would shadow this particular colleague, then that all needs to be designed, even if it needs to be virtual. You don't compromise and say, we don't have a coffee catch up as a part of that anymore, you know? So I think it's being very, very deliberate and designing in new and different ways. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of the brilliance that we have achieved has been where we've thrown around the traditional assumptions and traditional rule books. And we've said, well, what does this look like? You know, maybe it doesn't matter if I'm having a meeting with a client and there's 2 other people shadowing, because that's a part of their onboarding. Normally they'd come along, that's okay. So I think it's been very deliberate, and how can you use those moments to your advantage, no matter what the space may be. You know, some of them need to be designed differently, but you've got to be clear what's not negotiable, you know, because ultimately right now, those who are getting the onboarding right are winning with talent. Those that aren't are saying goodbye to the new talent they've hired very quickly.
It's always interesting how in the onboarding space, once you've been somewhere for a while, the organization becomes invisible to you because you just get used to it. And organizations do a bad job of selling the things that are actually important to new people because they become visible to them. So I think the key to this is to put yourself in the shoes of a new joiner and say, what would they have experienced in the past that told them the story of this organization? And how do we recreate that in a new world? But you really need to think from the view of a brand new person. So for an example, they wouldn't mind me saying this, one of my clients is Foxtel. So, you know, you turn up at your first day at Foxtel and it's a pretty bland building on a business park in, you know, North Ryde in Sydney. But you go in the front door and the first thing you see is a studio, and it's a live studio, and they're doing the news and the weather. And the sound stage is just up there. You get in the lift and there are decals of Game of Thrones everywhere. And everyone's walking around fast and they're moving with pace and they're going from place. And you get the sense of this is live and recorded TV, this is high quality. You just get that feel. And so they've got lazy about having to do anything about that because it's just a thing that gets delivered by the workplace. So they didn't do anything before. In the past, they haven't sent kits out to new starters or anything. Day one, you'll get it. So now they need to go, how do we recreate that for a person that's never going to come to that office, or maybe came once for an interview and is not going to come again for 6 months, or only comes once a day? What do we send them at home? How do we get this sense of who we are? How do we deliberately curate that? And another client we have here is St. Vincent's Hospitals. You go in their office and literally there are big decals of nuns everywhere, and religious artifacts. And you go, yeah, I get it. We're here to serve, right? I understand that's why we're here. And you kind of can't get away from it. So again, how do you recreate that experience that's invisible to those that work there every day because you stop seeing it after 6 months, for people that are new, so they go, understand the organization, understand the pace, understand the need for accuracy, understand the need for care, whatever it is, but do that in a way that's delivered to them at home, that's delivered to them over Zoom, that's delivered to them in that experience. And I think lots of places got lazy because the organization just delivered that for them. You now need to actually create it in a much more conscious way.
Thanks, John. There's loads of questions coming through. It will be a challenge to go through to half of them. But let me just follow up, because I mean, it's absolutely important that companies have this on their radar, right? And they recreate these experiences and they work on this. What is your advice for a graduate or someone starting a new job in this environment? If you could, if you had like the top 2 or 3 things that someone should do when they start a new job in a hybrid environment, what would those behaviors be? John and then Nicole.
That's a hard one. I mean, that's a really hard question. I haven't been a graduate for such an intensely long period of time that it's
not just like starting any job, right? Even if you're not a graduate, like going into a new environment is a challenge at the best of times. But if everyone's kind of somewhere but not in the same place, what are the things that you do?
Yeah, well, I think you have to trust yourself and be a bit brave, because you can't wait for things to come to you, because they're not. You're going to sit and kind of die in isolation unless you be a bit brave and get out there, and probably be a bit more pushy than you would otherwise feel comfortable with in building relationships, getting to meet people, doing stuff virtually. You're just going to have to be the more out there version of your normal self, because otherwise you're not going to make any kind of impact.
Fair point. Nicole?
Yeah, I agree. I think that courage, curiosity, I think this is a great example of where we often forget that the fundamental things that should and could be on our minds as a new joiner are really the same, right? I want to know, what are the things that are going to be important for me to be able to contribute to my full potential? Who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to work with? Where are the opportunities and challenges? And so, whereas normally if that is in that physical environment, that's happening around you in the flow, and you're almost able to think on your feet. Whereas I think now you've got to be a little bit more, as John said, courageous, proactive, deliberate, and actually design it a little bit more. So you may not have somebody walking past your desk saying, oh, have you thought about going and talking to Jill over there? You're actually now having to really make those moments when you have personal interaction, seeking out from your superior or your colleague, whereas normally you'd just have that in informal chat. So
that is interesting. That is interesting, because I mean, we have a question here about someone leading a team of introverts, and we heard it's a really interesting, counterintuitive, or even surprising finding, because when this first started in February, March, I remember reports or sort of profiles sort of saying, oh, this is really good for people who are introverts. They can now, we're all on the same footing now. We're all at home now, luckily we can get away from things, can concentrate on our work. But what I hear you both say is just the opposite, right? Even if you're an introvert, you have to be out there. You have to be actually much more proactive and be much more engaged and involved in making those connections and those moments happening. So that is really interesting. Let me move on to the next sort of lot of questions. And I'm probably not going to touch on what will become of the office, because we've done this, right? The office will change, and it'll be a place for collaborating and what have you not, and we will stick in front of our screens a bit more. I want to talk about sort of the way in which this pandemic work-wise is actually hitting different groups in society differently. And we had a question from Toby Marshall, who asked about the impact on the older generations, which is really interesting because there was a lot of reports, a lot of stats about how employment-wise, the pandemic has hit the younger generations quite hard. So a lot of people, young people who are in sort of casual work have dropped out in hospitality and what have you not. It's been hard on graduates finding jobs in this environment when we're shedding jobs. But the same seems to be happening at the other end as well. There's a Guardian article which says that people in the 50 plus, 55 plus are also losing jobs at a higher rate than everyone in the middle. With the added problem that, you know, when you're older, you are confronted with sort of a covert ageism. It's very hard to find new employment, especially in this environment. Now, there's a few questions I have in this. Do companies make a mistake when they, you know, let go of older, more experienced people? In particular, because we've seen other stats from research in Microsoft, for example, which said that counterintuitively, younger people are doing it much harder moving into this online environment because they're missing out on those social contacts, whereas the more experienced ones are doing actually quite a bit better mentally and well-being wise and motivation wise. So what is your experience, especially Nicole, you're in Japan, which is slightly different. So we can compare between Japan and their approach to age and John here in Australia. What do you see both in terms of employment, but also how people of different age groups cope with the situation? Maybe I start with John with Australia and then we bring in the Japanese perspective.
Sure.
So there's an obvious solution, right? You get to retirement age, you wait 30 years, and then you stand for president of the USA. Easy things.
Oh, there's about 20 years in between now. You've got to be 70 plus. But no, I go on.
Yeah, no, that's not better. Too soon, I suspect. So look, do organizations make a mistake? Yes, they often do. We are burdened with a social construct that's around careers, and careers start low, end high, and then literally end, and that's the kind of construct we have in our heads. And so once you hit whatever's your top point, it's assume that you're over and you're out. And that's a dreadful social construct that makes no sense. I think it goes to the point Nicole made earlier for the future, which is that we need to think of more kind of streams of jobs or more streams of ways of contributing that aren't all based around this dreadful, you know, lifelong career model. You know, unfortunately, we've built a bunch of systems around how you pay for education and how mortgages work and how you save for retirement that are all based on this sort of, you know, this gradual increase over life and then a drop at the end. So we need to start thinking differently about how people contribute to organizations. That's not just a promotion-based career model. And if we were able to do that, if we're able to genuinely free ourselves from that model and start to think about jobs being made up of tasks and tasks being able to be completed by different people in different ways, then I think we'd be able to take a more equitable approach to how we deal with people. But, you know, there's no policy answer to that. There's no government answer to that. This is a really, and Nicole can talk about it more because culturally it's quite different in Japan. This is a social construct that we need to change our view on. And if you talk to Linda Grattan, for example, who talks about the 100-year life, you know, she would say it's one of the most urgent things we need to do, because otherwise half of that life becomes kind of dead space, and that actually can't work out for individuals or for society. So yeah, there's no easy answer. Organizations could do a better job. We need to think about roles and how people contribute differently.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And it goes to what Nicole said earlier, right? We get the tech right. And usually, you know, technology things are easily changed, right? We know how to do this, but those social constructs, those worldviews, those taken for granted common sense notions of what a work life is, yep, they're much harder to change. So Nicole, what can we learn from Japan, or is there something we can learn?
There's always something to learn from Japan.
This is a rhetorical question, so go right ahead.
That's why I'm there. Look, yeah, I mean, a few general comments. One of the things that I feel very reassured and excited about is there's no question that, the future of work has really seen this continued shift from jobs to skills and capabilities. So skills and capabilities have become the currency. I think as a part of that, we are already starting to see universally some very new and different opportunities opening for both ends of the spectrum when we're looking at all ages of the workforce, right? There are some ways that the younger generation are contributing in relation to, rocket speed, power of AI and all of these things. But then there is so much that younger generation do not have access to today and never will. Think about the type of work today that is now automated. Think about the type of work today that never existed generations ago. And yet it's some of our more mature workers that actually experienced the manual handling. They understand the processes. They understand the critical moments in the work being done. So I'm seeing some really exciting opportunities where we are seeing some of the more mature workers, they are really being highly sought after. Because one, they are absolutely best positioned to train all of the robots and all of the AI because the younger generation just have never experienced it. Two, and I think this is possibly more important, as we see technology become more important, like I said earlier, the human dimension of how we work, how we interact is becoming important. And our younger generation are relying more and more on our older generation to bring that wisdom around interpersonal skills, developing relationships, around the business context, commercial acumen. So I'm actually seeing more and more all around the world, a really new, unprecedented opportunity where there is this real gap in our younger generation. And there's this amazing coaching, mentoring, wealth of abundance of opportunity, for our more mature workers. Now, in Japan, we do have the dilemma of seniority is a very important dimension. So that actually overlays all this, right? And it actually means that all of those things are really celebrated and become more important, perhaps more so in other regions. But I think those concepts are quite universal.
Let me latch on to the...
Can I get specific just for a second? Because I think specific is really important in this space because it's all about assumptions. So every organization that we collectively know, I suspect, manages their talent through a process that ends up with a 9-box bloody model, right? Everyone does it. It doesn't work. It's stupid. But nearly all organizations do it. And on one axis has got performance, and the other axis has got potential. And there's an assumption, and it's just because that's the model that everyone uses, that that is the right way to view a human being on a matrix of performance versus potential, which then causes you almost by default to go, oh, 55 or 60-year-old, no potential, right? They've either maxed out on their potential or they're not in our career path. Therefore, by design, they're in a bottom quadrant of any system that you've got in terms of your attention or focus on that individual, because they failed a mental model that we have of what it means to be a human in an organization. So those sorts of things are written through, they're written through how we recruit people, they're written through the mental model that managers have about what a person at a certain level should look or appear like. All of those things are just written into organizations.
And it's really interesting.
Bias against older people.
Well, there's a lot of talk in the US at the moment about institutional racism, but what you're talking about is institutional ageism, right? Yeah. There's certain models and processes that discriminate against, not overtly, but by way of outcome, by way of what they actually do, right? So that's a really important one that we want to highlight, and someone should do some research on this, or has done some research on this maybe. But I want to take the time for one more quick question, because we do run out of time and there are so many great questions, but there was one around education, and I can't help but pick up that one. So with a lot of people out of jobs, education, going to study and brush up on, Nicole, you said skills and capabilities is a good opportunity. So the question asked specifically, can this become a problem long term if people go and do postgraduate study, do a master's? Will this not lead to sort of an inflation that, you know, master's degrees now become expected because we have a whole new cohort of people who have brushed up on their education skills? Or are there different ways of actually going about this?
Yeah, I think that the education dimension is fascinating, especially right now. I mean, I think we all recognize that we've completely disrupted our traditional ways of thinking about how we learn and all of those things for some time, even before COVID. But I think obviously COVID has really accelerated some of the shifts. I think about it in the perspective of credentialing, you know, so I think of it in terms of, yes, we're going to continue to see more and more channels where people can get just-in-time learning in new and different ways. But I think what we're not going to see go away for a long time is the very important construct of credentialing, you know, where there's going to be certain types of learning, training, whatever, that continue to be sacred. So for me, I think that's the beauty of the hybrid that we're going to shift to. I think, yes, we're going to create that abundance of opportunity and access, but I do think that there's still going to be that governance around credentialing.
Thank you. John, you've got about 30 seconds.
Well, all I'd add is that we need to stop thinking of that as a thing that you do at the start of your life and think of it as a thing that you do throughout your life. And now's actually the opportunity for many people to do that, retrain, redevelop, re-educate, and then redirect their lives, not just when you're 24.
Also, education can be enjoyable. It's not just an end towards, it's not just a means towards, a means towards, you know, the climbing the career ladder, but actually learning something new. And I think we do need to create more of these opportunities to do this outside of the sort of big programs that we're used to. So before I hand over to Fiona, I do want to just do courtesy to some of the people who have asked questions that we didn't get to. There were some really interesting questions around the impact on employment. Will we end up with more contract, freelance, gig economy type work as a result? There was questions around what will become of the office as a physical space. There's questions around you know, the work from home situations. Are we still happy with, you know, kids and dogs in the background, or will this have to change? You could even ask questions about, will this change the architecture of houses going forward? Will there be, instead of a media room, an office? Will that come back? Or a media, or a sort of a Zoom room, if you like. And then questions around leadership. What can organizations do to create the kind of inspirational leadership that does well in a hybrid environment? So thanks to everyone who asked questions, and you can understand that we've squeezed a lot in and we had a super interesting discussion, but as always, time flies when you're having fun. I guess we need to do this again in 6 months' time and pick up on those questions. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks, John. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'm handing it back to Fiona.
Thank you, Kai, Nicole, John. I totally agree. 6 months, we'll be back. Really, really, I love getting the three of you together to discuss this, because it really does just become a discussion. And thank you, Kai, for acknowledging the number of questions that have come through on Slido. I do think that we've covered a lot of those questions in the themes that you've talked about. And certainly for me, those key takeaways have been around that blended hybrid workforces. You know, how are we going to manage the needs of both those working remotely and in the central physical office space? They need to be worked through, as John and Nicole have said, but you need to work through that now. I'm thinking about how you're onboarding people, recognizing, you know, that hybrid Zoom physical meeting. How does it change when you are, some of you are in the room and many of you are on the computer? I love the comment about operating under the illusion that we actually know our own organisation and how it works. I do think that is a bit of an illusion, and having that curiosity to really explore how your organisation works is important. And I think you made a really lovely point, Nicole, around that shift from jobs into skills and capabilities, and how that younger generation, you know, there is an old thing saying, you know, you can't put a wise head on young shoulders. And so really looking to rely on that older generation for mentoring in that space around building those relationships and that business acumen in all of those areas, but also for the older generation too, which is myself, be taught by the younger generation those cutting edge technologies that they're learning at the University of Sydney Business School. But, you know, they're bringing this into the workforce and being aware of the value that everyone brings is so important. So thank you. Thank you to everyone that's joined us today. Thank you to the over 5,000 people that registered for this seminar, these webinar series. Yes, this is the last one for 2020, but be under no illusion. We will be back next year with another series, and certainly we'll be looking at pulling Nicole, John and Kai together again. In the meantime, to stay connected and involved on discussions in the future of work, please visit our Sydney Business Insights website and contribute to the conversations that are happening there. Those of you that are worrying about the US election, I'll just give you a quick update. At the moment, Joe Biden is slightly in the lead. It appears he has 119 seats against Trump's 92. But let's face it, it's a long way to go. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and see you online again soon. Goodbye.